Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and welcome to the Forum Online. Restorative justice, an approach to justice that seeks to restore and repair the people and relationships impacted by crime, has seen worldwide growth since the 1990s. Rather than focusing on punishment, this philosophical approach to justice relies on values such as respect, participation, trust, accountability, and healing. My guest tonight is Deanna Van Buren. She's the executive director and co-founder of Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, one of only 500 Black female architects in the US, and she is a nationally known advocate for magnifying the role of design in creating social change. As we continue our exploration of the cathedral's theme of healing this year, we're going to be talking about building the change that we believe in. Thanks for joining me. So Deanna, there's so many questions I've been thinking of all week as I've been preparing for you to be here. And so many of them revolve around COVID and just the changes that we're experiencing. And downtown San Francisco still feels like a ghost town. And other cities that I've been to recently are a little bit more lively. But I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about just what architects are saying some of the changes are going to be in this new world that we experience after COVID.
Well, a lot of it, Malcolm, is we don't know. I think there's a lot of questions like what is the role of public space now, right? The space between the buildings.
Yes.
As being outside is considered safer for many folks, and they feel more comfortable in that context. Now people are going to work from home. Like a lot of places are going to go back to an office. So those office buildings that you see downtown, like what happens to those? Like if folks aren't coming back anymore, some are fully online. Some are like, oh, we're coming in swing shifts. Oh, we don't need that office anymore. We want to have these like little offices, which is a trend I'm hearing now. So we're kind of watching and to see what's going to happen with the built environment as we know it. It's going to be changing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that because I did think a lot about the glass towers, downtown places. Mm-hmm. But you're so right about just using public spaces in a different way. And even streets, I mean, I think it's revolutionary to start using streets for restaurants, streets for bicycle paths and walking. And it is a huge change. And it's almost, I'm kind of waiting for someone to say something about it so we can know a little bit more about what to expect for sure.
Wait and watch.
I know it's just. I'm glad you said that. The trustees keep asking me about wanting to have a big plan for the future, and we have the same thing with churches. We have no clue how many people are going to be in here. Yeah. So it's right. A very interesting time, but I also know there's a sense of celebration. Even walking around like Clement Street is our local neighborhood street. And, all the restaurants outside and the bars outside. I mean, the feeling is just, it's so different than it was a month ago.
Yeah. We're in a time of transition.
Yeah.
Really honoring transition.
Yeah, definitely. One of the questions I kept thinking about too was just, as a child, would you have guessed what would you guess from your childhood that would connect that with the woman that you grew into being? Like, were there signs that you were going to be an architect when you were a little girl?
I mean, there were a lot of obvious signs, Malcolm. It was pretty obvious. I don't know why my parents didn't see the fact that I was spending all my time building cities in the basement with blankets and Tinker Toys and blocks and Lincoln Logs. Like I'd use all the things, right? It was like, I used Legos. I'm like, I used all the sets of all the things, was pissed off they didn't go together. Like I can't stick the Tinker Toy into the Lego, but boy, did I try. So that was kind of, and then outside in the forest, building things.
Right, that's great.
Spaces for myself.
Yeah, my son was really he saw this book about tiny houses and he just absolutely fell in love with the idea of just creating these small little spaces.
Yeah, they're really comforting for us, right? That was kind of how I comforted myself. And I have slides so I can show them anytime. I can pop them up to show a picture of it, but
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, whenever you feel motivated or inspired, then definitely share us what you have tonight.
Well, I'll show this one. How that this is what they looked like. This how could you look at this like this? I mean, I didn't have a real picture of it, but I kind of recreated it. But how could you not guess that this is? I would make these little huts, right? I would make these little huts.
Great.
I'm like 5 here, and they were places for me within my context to feel safe, right? The environment I was in was pretty contentious, right? We segregated a white community as a Black family, and there was a lot of hostility. And I would just go make these little healing spaces for myself, these little peaceful places with light streaming in and whatever I could find. And, this was my primary coping mechanism.
Well, what I love about that so much is you've created a space around the table. Do you know what I mean? The table, which is that tree stump. In a way, that's what a church is. It's like a space around a table where we share this holy meal. I mean, you made a little church in
it was like a little church, and I'd put like little things on it. Like I'd collect like branches and leaves and berries, and I'd put like little food on it, like my fake food. I knew I shouldn't probably eat poisonous bear. I didn't do that, but like I would always have like a meal. A communion in my hut.
I love that. And I wonder too, just like about sacred spaces, because there is something that's just, Grace Cathedral in particular, there's, the moment I walk into that place, I feel I have such a strong response to it. And fortunately, I don't have to always think about what makes that happen. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sacred spaces. Like what, even just what you just said was, you were talking about the light, the way the light streams in the windows, and that's a huge part of our sacred spaces, those stained glass windows. But I wonder if you can just talk about, what makes a place feel holy or makes us feel connected to some kind of transcendent.
Yeah, well, I think you're speaking to some things, right? Basic fundamental things like light, the way that light penetrates a space. You feel the kind of hierarchy too of a place like that, right? There's a focus point that we're looking at. There's often an elevated ceiling, right? There's a kind of grandiosity to specific kinds of spaces. A space can be spiritual and be very small and tiny, right? It depends on what you're doing there. And I've always believed that whatever your intention is behind the space is what you'll manifest. And that a place, the energy of a place embodies what happens there, right? So if ritual is happening there time and time again, I believe it actually sinks into the walls and the floor and the ceiling and emanates that back at you.
Yeah, I completely do. I remember reading Christopher Alexander, the architect from Berkeley, talking about the world, objects having a kind of life in themselves. There's some objects that have less life and some that have more life. And it was such a strange idea when I first encountered it. And it just seems such a theological idea. I studied it like crazy and gave papers at the American Academy of Religion on it. I kind of wonder what the future of that is, because it had an effect on how I see the world for sure.
Yeah, I bet it did. I think that the something we always try to do is the integration of art into the environment. I think often when you go into sacred spaces, spiritual spaces, that's there, right? It's really embedded in the iconography, no matter what kind of spiritual practice you are doing, whether you're Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Christian, any of those, right? Those sort of places have artistic practice embedded in the very walls, right? And the ritual, that's a piece of it. And things, I oftentimes, especially older architecture, stuff was made by hand, not by machine.
Right.
And so you can feel it. You can feel stuff. They say that our bodies actually do respond to things made by hand and things that are natural, right? So if it's fake, you can tell the difference. Even if it looks a lot like wood, there's something about our bodies that knows and responds to that.
Yeah, Beth Israel, the Jewish congregation on California Street, has a stained glass window with like Half Dome from Yosemite in it. And it's absolutely breathtaking when you see it late in the afternoon, which is what it's designed for,
Sure.
But there's a way in which the place is connected. It's connected to the place where it is. And I think that's an important part of like sacred architecture too. To get that right it's hard.
You also mentioned something else about Half Dome being represented, right? So we know that representations of like real nature, but also just representations of nature calm us down. They soothe our nervous system, right? Our heart rate goes down. Like that's a form of biophilic design. which we like to embed in our work because it's so good for our bodies and our emotional health and wellness. So that's like a brilliant strategy, right? Stained glass window, lights coming in, and it's of a natural thing. So
and
brilliant.
You're so right. I mean, I have such a deep response to that place. I mean, it's a holy place for me. It's not like I'm not in there very often, but I love that biophilic design. That's totally what it is.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of just kind of like your inspirations in terms of architects? Like who are the people who came before you, whose work you've admired? Maybe you can even talk about buildings that mean a lot to you, or built spaces that mean a lot to you.
I really love architects that use materials in a beautiful way, right? In a sort of magical way. And as a young person, I didn't know any architects. I didn't get exposed to architecture formally until I went to college. And so I also tend to like architects who my new thing is I like architects who are activists, right? And are working in indigenous communities too. But in the US, I really love Todd Williams and Billy Chin. For folks who know them, like they really do beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. Lots of concrete, actually, but in this incredible way, and they integrate materials with all of that. I love Jeannie Gang, who's another great architect in the US, female architect, probably one of those most famous, globally known architects. And she's done, she had that beautiful tower, and I'm not even into towers. She's that beautiful tower in Chicago called Aqua, right? It looks like water, right? So talk about biophilic design. She's like, oh, Chicago doesn't have any mountains or topographic landscapes. So she created a tower to do that.
Wow.
And so there's some architects that are really just, and some of the things are very subtle. Like I'm not a big form making person like Frank Gehry and those types of folks. Like things that are a little quieter, like Alvar Aalto, who's a Finnish architect who made some very simple but complex, very much connected to nature. So those are some architects. And people always ask me, Malcolm, and I should always just have my list, because later I'll be like, oh my God, I love this one and this one and this one. In the moment, I'm always like, ah!
The question, like, why did you get ordained? You'd think it like have an answer to that worked out, right? But every time I'm like, oh man, that's right. I should have spent the time thinking about the answer.
That's right. That's right.
Do you know of any Hawaiian architects? I mean, off the top of your head? I
don't. I've only met one Hawaiian architect who did prisons, and I met him when I would go to the the AAJ conference, which is a conference for justice architects, and was always trying to convince him and others not to do that anymore. But he was a really nice guy, though. But yeah, I would love to know more Hawaiian architects, and I've worked with architects from Hawaii in practices here in California. Yeah, but I haven't met many.
As you're talking, I was like, oh man, I wonder if I probably know the people in his prisons.
Right.
Oh my gosh, crazy. Tell us about architecture school and what's that like? Like how long it lasts, and just kind of, I mean, everybody has a sense of this kind of the paper chase for law school and what medical school is like from with that movie, that TV show that takes place in Seattle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that one.
That one.
But what is architecture like?
If anyone who's ever been at a school that has an architecture school will often say, oh yeah, the lights were always on in that building.
That's exactly what I would say.
And they never came out of that building.
Yes.
And they were just, it's kind of brutal. It's kind of a brutal, grueling process. I mean, it can last anywhere, if you want a professional degree, from 5 to 7 years. I went to architecture school for 7 years.
Wow. And
you're just in the studio, right? You have a studio space, and that's your primary. You have studio class, 3 days a week for 4 hours each time.
Gosh, that's amazing.
And you're working, and you're creating your ideas and your sketches and your models, and then you're presenting them, and you don't sleep. And I remember I didn't sleep for 3 days one time, and I was hallucinating, but I was still doing my model. Like, really? Really? People slice my finger off because you're blood everywhere. Like, that's like a normal occurrence in architecture school. So if you want to go, I always tell young people, if you want to go to architecture school, really got to want to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if you can talk about just like your impressions of, maybe your colleagues, your classmates, your teachers, ways that you change, not just as a result of just making it through this arduous ordeal, but also just, kind of what kind of things you learned.
I think, I learned to think conceptually let me describe that, right? I learned about how to take an idea, right? An amorphous idea or like a philosophy like restorative justice, for example.
Yeah.
And then what do we create from that philosophy or that idea or a simple concept about movement, right? You might start with an idea about movement. Oh, how does my building facilitate and communicate movement? And I think that was a powerful, it took a while. It was hard for me to make that transition. All the artists, all the people who'd gone to art school were like, I got this, but I'd gone to like a traditional architecture school before going to get my master's. And that was a really powerful thing to begin to work from, right? I want to design a space that's about hope or, immigration, people transiting, people coming together from different backgrounds in an environment. What would that be like? So, and I learned how to design in architecture school, right? They don't teach you much more than that. You got to learn on your own once you get out, and how to represent visuals.
I was even thinking wondering if architects are having conversations about just like social distancing, because you may have been building these places to bring us together. And then all of a sudden, that's when I saw buildings kind of breaking down, I guess, if you will. They're not designed to have people.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. They weren't designed for a pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
No, they just weren't. And I have cautioned folks, even my team, like, don't let the future of design be about a pandemic. Like, don't let this moment in time be reflective of this, right? We have climate change going on. So we have a lot of other things we have to include and integrate. Not that we don't respond at all, right? One thing we might get out of this is like, we're just going to have better air systems in buildings, right? That circulate the air more quickly, that have more operable windows or things like that. And those are great things to think about. But designing for social distancing,
that's so
it's
depressing.
Not our future. The last pandemic here was 100 years ago. We were designed for that. I don't know. I just we have to be careful about how intensely we embed that, because when we build stuff, I always say we build what we believe. Yeah. And that when we build it, it anchors and foments the thing that you believe.
Yes.
So if you're terrified and it's all about separation and you build that, it locks you in. And architecture lasts a long time. So I would say, let's design for flexibility. Let's think about it like that.
I think a lot of the kind of anti-terrorism like mechanisms around buildings in New York City, for instance, there is a kind of fear that's built into them. And you're definitely right.
You believe it, we build it. It's just a fact.
It's so true. And it's so funny because Elaine Scarry wrote this book called The Body in Pain, which I don't recommend very many books, but I do recommend it. But it's like she said there's two kind of parts of torture. One is you make things up and then you make it real.
That's right.
And that's what we do when we build buildings. You're right. We solidify these faiths in a way.
Yeah, that's right. There's a professor at Princeton Dr. Benjamin Ruha, and she says we have to acknowledge that the built environment is designed by others. Like, we're living in someone else's imagination.
Yes.
Right? We're not living in our imaginations, right? We didn't design this world around us. Right. So as we start to grow and change and shift, a sort of a radical reimagining is required for us to begin to rethink this world around us. And if we believe in equity, right? If we believe in social justice, what does that environment look like? Because our built environment wasn't designed for that.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest questions, because there's often times where I think I feel a sense of gratitude for the people who came before us. I mean, like the people who thought up Golden Gate Park, for instance, and made that a reality and stopped the development of the Marin Headlands or what have you.
Yeah, we've done some good things. I like how you're talking about open spaces, Malcolm. You haven't named any, like the people that stopped the building from happening and made sure we had nature there, which is super important.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking, I mean, in the things I read to prepare for meeting you, I read about just, like those freeway projects that would just cut cities in half, so, and so you have like the Big Dig in Boston, which is kind of removing that. And then you have like all the freeway structures in Oakland, in San Francisco that have been removed. So even that was just, it was a terrible mistake to make those scars on our cities. But then they thought of ways of kind of reopening them again. And so like my experience of San Francisco is just very different than my children's were, because they just don't even know about these raised freeways that were.
I don't either. I didn't live here then, and people talk about them and I just can't imagine it. I can't imagine those places with a freeway over top of it.
Yeah, no, completely. Yeah, one of the things I completely wanted to ask you about too is like, so Julia Morgan, we're always seem to be around Julia Morgan buildings, but in other than her, I mean, it is the built environment that we have is a white male constructive environment. And you're right, it wasn't constructed for equity or justice, or there are a lot of other aspects too that are limitations of that. And I wonder if you could just talk about what it means to be in a world that was constructed under those circumstances, and then what the future will look like that'll be different, because we will have Hawaiian architects and African-American architects and transgendered architects, et cetera.
I hope so. I really hope so. I'm very excited about that future. I mean, I think that, and I would say like white privileged males were the ones who were
completely, who could
building,
go to Paris and take classes.
Oh yeah. Or work for free because their daddy has lots of money. Like that was still going on when I was at the school.
Yeah.
And so I think, you see a lot of examples of that, or in both the highways, but like that sort of tower in the park idea that you saw, those towers that happened like Cabrini Green in Chicago, and a lot of the tower infrastructure in New York, where Black and brown folks were just housed in there. Those are terrible environments for families, terrible environments. And that was a vision from a privileged white male who thought, I'm brilliant. I have an idea. We're going to make these towers and they'll be around the parks. Never involved anybody in thinking through that, didn't care, so we see a lot of disinvestment in Black and brown communities. They're next to the toxic land use. Yeah. Right. They always put that stuff there.
Right. Completely.
So people's bodies are being harmed. Right. The environment then is toxic and not healthy. Those freeways cut out their main street, their high street, their economic centers. They cut out the whole core. And then prisons and jails are such great examples of what we built instead. Justice cores, right? You guys have been by now, like where the courthouse is and the bail bondsman and the jail is there. Like we build this stuff really, really intentionally. And so, right now when I work with folks, I'm like, okay, we have a lot to unbuild. But at the same time, we have to reimagine the new thing. Like what's this new paradigm, these new places that we're creating together? And I love that. I love doing that with communities. I love to help them understand you have an imagination. You get this. This is innate. Built environment is actually innate. We started by living in caves, and then we've always lived in some kind of infrastructure. We've been building stuff for centuries, millennia. So we know, right? Most people in the world build their own homes, all of those things. So we really try to imagine, like, what would a world where restorative justice was the primary way of addressing harm in our communities? What would that look like? I can show some examples. I'll just
I would love to see that. I can have some slides.
Yeah. So this is just the process, right? This is when you say, Malcolm, like, what would the world look like, right? It begins with a process, right? It begins with engaging folks who've never had a stake, right? Never had a voice in what that might look like and feel like. This is just me working with someone who's a currently incarcerated group of folks. We did these design studios with them. And I was like, imagine what kind of space you would need to face the harm that you had done, or the worst harm you'd done to had been done to you, right? And they were coming up with incredible spaces, right? Centers for health and wellness, right? Instead of that. Museums about restorative justice called A New World. I mean, it was amazing. And they were healing in the process, right? People were starting to cry and access trauma and heal through just the reimagining of what is a space? What if we made spaces of forgiveness instead of spaces for punishment?
Yeah.
And so I'll skip to the actual some of the projects, but restorative justice is a huge inspiration. Like, what does a Center for Peacemaking look like? Right, where we would come to actually engage. And it turns out it kind of looks like your home, right? Like a space that you can be together.
Yeah, just like we were saying earlier, and prisons are really built on the principle of fear. I mean, it's fear everywhere. It's just like you walk in the door and it's just like, it's tangible in the air. And
no, it's really, so like we starting, when you start to look at what kind of environments people actually want to be in, they're deeply integrated with nature, right? They tend to feel like you're at home. Everyone wants to feel like, every time I do this work with folks, they're like, yeah, can we just make it cozy with some comfortable couches and some fuzzy carpets and some nice lighting, right? Like, how can we do that, and we can. Like, stuff doesn't need to look all corporate and shiny and glossy and slick, and it's a totally familiar, right, but comfortable kind of place to be.
Yeah, in a way, and we went through a period of just making architecture look like a machine.
Because it's made by machines make it. The Industrial Revolution really took us out of the craft of making buildings, at least in this country and in the West, right? We look at other places, parts of the world, in India and Indonesia or Asia, where people still make stuff by hand because the cost of labor is low, right? So it has other ramifications. But here we make them from machines. So you can tell when you look around how machine made the aesthetic is. And how do we combat that?
That's exactly right. Can you tell us a little bit about designing justice, designing spaces? Just like, how did it come into being, and just kind of what trajectory are you on with that?
Yeah, I had started a firm about 10 years ago, almost to the day.
Wow.
I started a small firm called Form Design Studio, and I was like, I'm going to make spaces for restorative justice, right? That's what I'm doing. And I didn't have no money. And people thought I was crazy. Maybe I was a little bit. And through that process, right, it was actually the Syracuse Peacemaking Center, the image I just showed, that I realized as I was engaging the community, like, oh my God, we got to make these places. It was going well. We had this beautiful vision. There was no money. Like, how are we going to pay for this place? And I realized in that moment that we needed to have a firm that did both the beautiful visuals and the aesthetics and the architecture, but also the real estate and finance. So designing justice, designing spaces expanded both what we did, but also like, wow, restorative justice is not enough. We actually have to look at this entire system of mass incarceration and end it, and build the infrastructure to end the whole system altogether. And we decided we would do that by building these prototypes. And that's been about 5 years now that we've been doing that work.
Can you show us any images about the prototypes? Do you have any of those in your?
I do. I sure do. Restore Oakland is one.
Oh, great. So now it's coming up.
Can you see it? Restore Oakland is one.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the country's first center for restorative justice and restorative economics.
Oh,
right?
I love that. I love having the chalkboard be the whole thing. Like, you're inviting a conversation to take place, and some people may not feel comfortable talking, but they feel more comfortable writing something on the board.
That's right. Or going to a small space at the back to get away from, to away of things. And the spaces are on the right, or like you love the light. The light is coming in, right? So the spaces are light filled, and there's food here and organizing here. But this is where young people get diverted out of court and come into peacemaking and restorative justice instead of going to court.
Yeah.
So that's one. And then we're working on one in Detroit, a restorative justice center there too. This is brand new visuals. You guys are seeing it for the first time. We just finished. This is a project that will have circular rooms, right? So folks can do restorative justice here in a very clear way with rooftop gardens and outdoor gardens, right? So the integration of those things. And then our pop-up village, which is about creating pop-up temporary environments, both for restorative justice, for community to come together, right? For us to be together.
Yeah.
So And this is popping up already. We're popping up soon in San Francisco. So you guys should come on July 10th. Come by for our pop-up pregnancy village. So those are some of them. And I guess I don't know if my slides were showing before, but this was the project, the Near West Side Peacemaking Center, that got me thinking, we can make this environment. And this project is so successful, right? Folks are coming here for peacemaking. The elders in the community are the ones who are moderating that, right? So people are getting diverted out of court and they're coming here using Native American peacemaking practices. So how do we build for a different set of values and a way of being as a people? And what do those environments look like, and how do we create them together?
Yeah. What are the prisons of the future going to look like, or just places where we can find people?
Well, our belief is that we don't need them, and that we want to abolish them altogether. Right. And so when I work with these men and women, incarcerated men and women, and we're designing together, they're thinking about very different kinds of environments, right? They are thinking about these places where they are building their own homes, where their families might be able to come, where they're taking almost like a break from things, and they're really learning how to heal, right? That there's healing involved. They know that they need that. And so I think, honestly, if we provide people with what they need, with good living wage jobs, with access to good education, with healthy food, right? Meaningful work, we don't need these institutions. They are not, that we didn't used to have them, and we're addicted and over-reliant upon them. So what does a world without that infrastructure look like? That's the goal, right? That's the goal we're heading towards.
One of the things the first thing I asked you was just about changes around the pandemic. But there's another question too, that's just as equally important. And I think it's part of everybody's consciousness too. And that is just changes after the death of George Floyd, as people respond with outrage to just different kinds of police injustices. And I wonder how is that affecting architecture, just in your experience?
Yeah, well, look, I can speak from my own personal experience of our work. And that after that time, what our messaging and what we were saying and trying to do got amplified. I've been talking about this for a decade, and now people were finally returning my calls and responding like, oh yeah, the system is structurally racist. We should make restorative justice centers, right? You could start to see this toppling, right? The American Institute of Architects finally spoke out about we shouldn't design spaces for incarceration. Let's make restorative justice centers instead, right? So they were picking up the language that we'd been speaking, which is great, right? It's all good. Right. And our phones started ringing off the hook, and we're seeing capital flowing towards the building of new things. So while it was a painful time, the awakening has really helped people understand that we have to invest in communities of color, disinvest from the criminal justice system, and it's happening. Yeah, it is happening.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because like you say, it's just like we are building that future that's the generations from now are going to live with, for better and for worse.
Yeah,
and building a society where all people are valued, and where everyone thrives, and where we have incentives to look out for each other instead of to fear and build walls between each other. I mean, it's like essential work. I'm getting distracted though, because I forgot to tell you about this, Deanna. But one of the practices we have is we ask our audience to give us questions. So
good.
They're texting me all these questions like mad.
And you're just ignoring all the people, Malcolm. You're ignoring all the people.
They're so good. So here's one. There are several sacred ground groups at Grace Cathedral. As we complete this 10-session Episcopal program, some of us are interested in working in and or supporting restorative justice endeavors in the San Francisco Bay Area. Can you recommend any existing programs run by the communities most impacted by our current system that we might work with and or support? That's a great question.
There's some great groups. I mean, the Eller Baker Center for Human Rights, that are one of the owners of Restore Oakland, are doing great work in community. What I love about what they're doing is they run and host circles, but they also are abolitionists, right? So they're doing a lot of multiple facets of the work, which I really love. Community Works West is another great group that's doing incredible restorative justice work. My colleague Karina Montag just started a group called Stronghold. They're doing wonderful restorative justice work in the Bay Area. So, you know, there's a lot of groups. We're very fortunate to have Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth is another great one that has been around a long time and really advancing to have restorative justice be the primary way of addressing harm in our schools. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of restorative justice leaders here, like Fania Davis.
Oh yeah, I love being in a place where there's so much creative work happening and such passion too. Here's another question. I can't believe I didn't even think about this because I have a whole bunch of questions I just didn't. I'm never going to get to. But can you say something about the new city, which is not built for the car, but has bikeways and big sidewalks and a small store 5 minutes away? I think there's an idea of the 15-minute city. Get anywhere on foot or bike in 15 minutes.
That would be great, right? That's what people want, right? Yeah. And I think that it would require, now imagine that that's your city, right? That would mean you'd have to have the jobs local to you, right? You'd have to be able to walk to your job, right? The schools would have to be local, your food, you know, for folks living there. And if it's 15 minutes, right? Do you have these little 15-minute clusters, right? Or these little sections and clusters that you can get to? What if you want to go to a cluster that your friend lives over in the other 15-minute cluster that's like on the other side? Like, how do you get there, right? You could ride your bike, you know, do we have public infrastructure that supports that, right? Instead of getting in your car, I would love to see more investment in that than freeways and things like that. So we have to begin to think about, I love that concept because it's really about hyper-local access to resources. And every single community we talk to, that's what they want.
Yeah. It's funny because
they want to walk 15 minutes.
The city ideal, and I feel like we've been on a trajectory toward that 15-minute city. One of my favorite books that I ever read in my life was Crabgrass Frontier, about how suburbs were invented. I mean, in part
they totally were
racial segregation,
made up and sold. Like and I'm glad you read that. If anyone ever sees the ads for suburbia, they're hilarious. They're also frightening and painful to see because it was sold. It was sold, marketed.
We're in the process of desuburbanization. And I think a lot of people think that COVID gave a big shot in the arm to suburbs, but you know, I think we're going to return to those values of the city too. Okay. So I didn't mean to go ahead to interrupt.
Oh, no, I was just saying that, you know, the interesting thing about the suburbs is that folks are moving back into cities. And guess who's getting pushed out to the suburbs?
Yeah, right. That's exactly
version of the thing. It's pretty. Yeah,
you're totally right. I mean, basically, what it is it's kind of like an evil, you know, crabgrass country.
To live there, and it's like it was a bad idea to begin with.
Completely. So you're right. So Vallejo and Richmond and. Yeah, so you hollow out all the communities of color in the center of San Francisco, and where does everybody move?
Them out.
Yeah, exactly.
You push them out. Yeah.
Airfield, that far away. Yeah, that's a really good point. That, you know, it breaks my heart to think too. I mean, it's one thing to commute into a big city, you know, if you're the CEO of the company, but man, you know,
your fancy car and all that stuff. Yeah.
To be like a nurse or a custodian and to just, you know, just be barely holding on, and it's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Here's another question. This is good too, because this person did their homework. I've read your wonderful work in learning spaces such as mobile classrooms. What architectural considerations do you believe designers of schools should have?
Yeah, you know, the type of school that you're thinking about, right? The kind of learning that happens there is equally as important as what you design. So one question I often ask is like, well, what kind of pedagogical technique are we using? The School on Wheels was about one-on-one instruction, right? Restorative justice was part of that curriculum. It was specifically designed for independent learners who were formerly incarcerated, who were coming home. So the design had to allow for one-on-one learning, had to allow for restorative justice circles and reading circles to happen there. And so I always question the paradigm of the teacher at the front and the desks all lined up. Like, what is that pedagogical paradigm? What if it's project-based learning? Like, why don't we design for that? We know there's definitely evidence-based design research, and like, we know there needs to be daylight because it improves short-term memory and keeps you alert, right? Those kinds of things. That there's, deep integration with outside, right? With nature. You could have classrooms, you could have classes outside, all of that, right? And what's the integration between a school and a community, right? So how do you design so the community might be able to use the school in the summertime or at night?
Right,
that sort of shared recreation areas, shared kitchens. There's a lot of exciting ways to think about how to embed do you have restorative justice in your school, right? So what is the culture of the place? How are you teaching and learning? And start there, because I think we build what we believe, right? If you believe in a certain way of learning and understanding the world and exploring the world and dealing with conflict, you can design a school for that. The school will manifest, right? The architecture of the school will manifest the paradigm or the pedagogy that you start with. So I always ask people to start there.
That's completely my experience. I mean, based on the schools that I know really well right now, they're completely different than the schools that I grew up in. And for all those things, I mean, there's a way in which we are making progress, I think, architecturally, in terms, like you said at the beginning, you said people know like what's good for them in terms of architecture. It's just like, how do you design processes to include their vision in how we make things?
Yeah, absolutely. Young people, if you're designing a school, the students and teachers should be part of that design process. And I think a lot of architects do that, but you got to do it deeply. You got it really deeply.
Yeah, and our schools that were project-based schools just had kind of like different little areas where we'd focus on different kinds of projects. And then you'd
that's right.
move to the next area. And
that's right. That's how I would want. That's the kind of school I'd want to design.
Yeah, Reggio Emilia was the philosophy for the school.
Yeah.
And it was super cool.
Exactly.
All right, here's the next question that just came in on the wire. Your work is brilliant. Oh, you got a lot of fans, and your spirit is great. In the course of your work, there must be many challenges and obstacles. What restores you and keeps you going in both the work you do and in your spirit?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. That's one of my favorites. I think that all of this work is a thing, but, I think that I spend a lot of time meditating. I have a good meditation practice.
Yeah, me too.
And I do a lot of, retreat work, really doing my internal work, keeping myself resourced by being in nature. I love to hike. I love to camp. I love to be out in the world. I love to dance. Dancing is super important for me, both conscious dance practices, right? So I love, 5 rhythms. For those I love soul motion, right? Which is a great soul dance, right? So I love those kinds of movement practices and somatic practices, and working with the body, but also just sitting with spiritual teachers, learning from them, right? I love science. I love the Science and Non-Duality Conference. I don't know if you've ever been. I love that conference, right?
Yeah, I love that.
Science, spirituality, like I love it. Woo! All that stuff.
Yeah, Zygon magazine.
Oh yeah,
I love that stuff. And it's funny once you say you're a dancer, I'm like, oh, I get it. Do you know what I mean? There's something that it's part of architecture and movement are connected. They're important.
Yeah, but so is spirituality and movement, right? Can you think of a time or people who didn't use and don't maybe still do use dance as part of a sacred ritual, right? A sacred thing. So
it's one of the biggest problems with Christianity as I practice it is it's almost like we're just like these like walking brains. And it's part of what I love about Grace Cathedral. We have a yoga practice on Tuesday nights that has like 600 people come to it, or before COVID it did. And it's so important for people to find spiritual practices that involve the body.
Yeah. But Malcolm, you guys should just get down at the service. Like, just get down.
You're totally right. You're totally right.
Just break loose.
We have to think. It's funny because
just bust out.
We had in my old church, we had this girl who was a dancer, and she just liturgical dance was her thing. And God bless her. She just she'd teach us to pray the Lord's Prayer in physical motions.
Yeah. Like my relatives at the Black church, like people were like a 100-year-old woman, Malcolm. She was getting down in the aisle. And everybody did. Like there's a sort of the body expressing celebration and joy and connection to source. It's wonderful. So that's your next
I know, it's my goal. You're right.
You gotta learn to cook. And then you're going to dance. You should have told me that. You should have told me that before we got on here.
I'm going to write that down. Cook and dance. And then you're right. My life will be, and that's part of it about COVID too, is there's so much tragedy. It was so heavy, but there were some good things that came out of it too. Just, you had to be really paying attention to it.
Yes.
One of the things I had that was I thought I had too is I have a sense for what makes it difficult to be an Episcopal priest today, or what makes it difficult to be clergy today. What is the most difficult thing about being an architect today? Not just in your area, but for architects kind of across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I'm an unusual architect, so I practice differently than other architects. I sort of view things. So some of my challenges are maybe not their challenges, but I think across the board, what my experience was that people don't really understand what we do, right? People don't really get it, and they don't actually value it because they don't get it. And so architects are forever trying to make themselves relevant in a world where they've actually made themselves irrelevant. They made themselves irrelevant by only working for the wealthy and powerful, right? So you're always, as an architect, you're always at the whim of your client and the person that can afford to build buildings.
Yes.
So they're chasing down the work, and they're competing with each other to try to get the thing. I was like, y'all, stop doing that. Don't do that. There's another way. There's another way. And the way that we're doing it is like, I'm in service to Black and Brown communities most impacted by mass incarceration. They're who I'm in service to. I work with them. I listen to them. We are philanthropically funded, right? So what allows us to work this way are philanthropic dollars, right? Yeah. And I've been very fortunate to have some wonderful donors and foundations who kind of let me just do it my way. Yeah. And we're able to generate new ideas and new things like the School on Wheels, right? Because we were listening to community, we heard what they needed, and we were able to come and provide a space and environment that they wanted, right, with them. Yeah. So our challenge on the way that we practice, right, because I'm not chasing down rich developers anymore, right? I'm not chasing down municipalities, is really the mindset of folks that we do work with, right? The belief that it could be different, right? The belief that they can own things, right? The mind is a powerful barrier, right? That we can end mass incarceration, that it is possible. It doesn't have to be like this, right? So we're trying to break people out of paradigms. We're not trying to chase down rich guy. So
I get it.
Different challenges.
I was at a dinner party the only dinner party I've been to in a year and a half. And everybody around the table is talking about the permitting office, like getting building permits. And I'll tell you, that was exactly.
I'm sorry. That sounds like the most boring.
Well, I mean, for me, I've never owned a house, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that I'll ever be able to afford a house. And so I basically was just like, oh, that's what rich people talk about.
It is. Sure, right. Building apartments, how many get my stuff done? Right, exactly. I mean, and that is real, right? All architects, it is real, right? Trying to get through the hurdles to get something built is one of the hurdles to Black and Brown communities, right? It shouldn't be that hard. Yeah. We can't afford to spend tons and tons of money on an expediter and get past the building department. It has a purpose. I'm not saying we don't need codes and people need to be safe. Oh, completely. But you need to make it possible for us to build the right stuff.
Yeah. And in a way, I mean, the only time I really worked with the building process, well, the only times I've worked with the permitting offices have been just on behalf of churches.
Of course,
I'm kind
yeah.
of impressed that they care about including the community's opinions on things. So you just
Sure.
don't have just the churches kind of running railroad over everybody's
Sure.
neighbors.
Yeah.
So my experiences haven't been that bad. I mean, it's a
Good.
challenge for sure. So
Good,
yeah,
good. You sweet talked them. You got to
I don't
sweet
know.
talk people at the building department.
Well, maybe the architects who helped us were really good too.
Good. Maybe they were. You had some good sweet talkers.
I mean, we did. We had helpful people said, well, people like you said this church is never going to be able to do this on its own. And
You
we're going to
gotta
do pro
pull it
bono
together.
work for the church. Exactly.
Yeah,
That's totally
yeah.
what happened.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned just in passing before was just kind of like sustainability and how that's changing architecture. And I wonder if you can just talk about, like, I don't know, how solar power is changing things. Just like how are we starting to build for a more environmentally, a better environment in terms of.
Yeah. Well, that's the part architects have managed to advance. The social equity, not so much. The economic equity, not so much. But on the environmental sustainability side, they've really been able to push that. And one thing that I'm looking at with DJDS, which is exciting, is really embedding biophilia. I mentioned it earlier, but biophilic design is really pushing past pushing past the normatives that we have. And one thing that my biophilic practitioners are looking at is how can what you build there actually replicate what would have happened there had you just left it with nothing, right? If nature was there right before you got there, you put a building on it, how can your building be just as regenerative, right? Just as much of a space of carbon sequestration and recycling water and generating power and culturally support. Like it's a much richer, and I was going to share, maybe I will, the 14 principles of biophilic design. You could look that up. Yeah. It's a great article to look at. Very clear, very well put together, that really talks about all of the things we talked about too, about marrying and mimicking nature, right? Mother Nature is brilliant, does what it does. We just need to learn from it. And architecture should respond to that and begin to embed a lot of those things into it. So things should move, and spaces should have like a lot of texture and interest, and we should support prospect and refuge, right? Coziness and long views and all of these things, and create biohabitat, right? There's no reason your roof shouldn't be a habitat for bees and butterflies. Yeah. All of that. So beyond LEED, I call it.
The site itself was a gift and a benefit to the creatures that were there. And I love the idea of thinking, how do we continue to be a benefit?
Yeah. What we build shouldn't be destroying. It should just be, giving back, to be generous. Like, I think in our workshop, we did this workshop just this past week, and it was something about generosity. Like, what does a generous building look like, right? An abundant and generous building. Like, how do we start there rather than, does it tick all my little prescriptive code boxes?
I love that. This is the first time I ever realized that generous, it's related to the Greek word genao, which means to beget. So it's like how you have children. It's like how you populate the world with creatures is by begetting something. Yeah, I didn't think about it until you just said it. Tell us about like a building that you worked on that you just really loved, like that really sticks out in your mind as something that you just enjoyed, a project you just really enjoyed doing.
Okay, so it's not a building, but it's still design. It's still architecture.
Yeah, it is.
So one of the most exciting projects I ever worked on was a video game. And the video game was called The Witness. And so I got to design a whole world. Like,
that's great.
It had like 50 buildings on it.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
I worked on that project for 5 years, and it was a building game. It was a video game about developing a visual language, and it was very peaceful, right? So it was just you came to an island, you had to play puzzles, you started to learn the puzzles, and you saw the puzzles in the sky and in the architecture and in the ground and tweeting birds. Like, it was brilliant. It was the best. It was the best. My client was so mean sometimes, and he was so demanding, but he was so brilliant and creative. And came out on Apple's new launch, and it was like a huge success, and it was so beautiful, and I loved every minute of it. It was the single most
great.
Who gets to build a whole world? Like I was like, this is amazing. Amazing. I designed a bazillion buildings in that thing.
I think so much about technology and how much it's changed things. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, just like the technologies that have changed in architecture in the last 30 years. And some of them are just the internet and social media, but there's probably more than that, right?
The biggest thing happening technology, architecture, the construction industry is slow. Like the whole thing, they're kind of way behind everybody else, right? Construction tech is only in the last couple years has the tech industry even tackled construction. So more of what we're seeing now is manufactured buildings, right? So buildings that are designed like units in factories. So you can see in the Bay Area some of these buildings, because we had some of those factories here, where the whole thing is made in the factory and then assembled quickly on site. So that is like a lot of technology, and then how high they can start to go. We also now have, you can make timber skyscrapers, right? So we've just changed our building codes in the US that you can actually go up really tall with wood. And that's a big technology piece that I'm excited about, because they're beautiful, right? You walk into these spaces and it's all wood, everywhere, and that's just exposed wood. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering exactly how tall we can go, but I think it's like 20 floors, right? 20 stories with wood. So those are two things that I'm excited about. I'm actually excited about both, because I think anything we can do to get, affordable, good housing.
Yeah.
To happen.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about too, is just like the materials, building materials and techniques too, changing and maybe democratizing the experience of architecture for people.
Yeah. Well, I also, can I say I remembered another architect I love, Anna Heringer.
I'm going to write her down.
She's the German architect, and she does these beautiful buildings in mud, all mud brick.
Oh, that's cool.
It's divine. I love her work. So I'm just thinking about, we talk about technology, but sometimes just using old technology is the best way to go, right?
Yeah.
Mud brick, most buildings are made of mud brick.
Yeah, a few times during our conversation, I thought about the Panamanian exhibit, like the World's Fair in San Francisco in like 1915 or something. And a lot of that was like mud brick, like hay bales covered with plaster.
Let's advance that. How can we make that work, right? Those are sustainable materials. So if we can advance that, the engineering around mud brick, right? Let's get our engineers to focus on that piece and get our building department to say it's okay, because they're like, hell no.
Oh, that's so great. So I mean, this is what I can't believe, is that we're out of time. We're actually at the end of our time, because we just went so quickly. But I wonder if you can just tell us about some signs of hope that you see, just some signs of hope that you're experiencing or that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, one big piece of hope, and I don't mean to get too technical or over there, but we're starting to do work in LA County and in other places where they are really trying to build an entire network of alternative systems to incarceration, alternative spaces where they're putting a care first, jails last. So what does a distributed network of holistic care environments look like? What are restorative care villages? What would it look like if we actually cared for our people rather than incarcerated them? And they're doing it, right? They have a plan to do it. If you ever want to look at it, the Care First, Jails Last initiative, the county supervisors approved that plan and to implement it right before COVID. Like I literally flew down there and I spoke in front of them. I was like, this is my dream, right? That you're doing it. You're doing it. Yeah. And we're starting to see jails closing down all over the country as organizers push to fight. So it's happening, right? We're starting to turn back and understand that caring for people is what keeps us safe, right? Caring for one another, caring for people, and to see that what's happening in LA gives me great hope
I'm writing
that this
that
is
down.
possible.
Caring for people keeps us safe. In a way, I wish that, just that they show that the COVID curve of the number of new cases every day. I mean, I wish they'd show the incarceration curve and put that before us more frequently, so that we could see what kind of progress we're making on.
Yeah, you can track it. I track it. Vera Institute. You can track what they're saying. And there's groups that are tracking these things. I try to follow them, and we see an ebb and flow. Right, a lot of folks were released, and then they got put back in. So it's the fight must keep fighting.
Yeah. Well, Deanna, what a pleasure and a blessing it is to be able to spend this time together. And thank you so much, not just for being on our program, but also for the work that you're doing. I feel like it's so essential for us to be working on thinking about how the design environment affects how we treat one another and how we care for each other. And I especially think that the prison system is absolutely broken. And I'm so grateful to have somebody who's in the trenches working on these important issues.
Thank you, Malcolm. I appreciate you all inviting me to be here. It was wonderful.
Yeah. And to everybody else, this is the final forum of the spring season. So please look for announcements about our fall season, which will start in September. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK, to 76278. And again, thanks so much, Deanna Van Buren, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for your work.
Bye,
okay,
everybody.
good night, everybody.
Good night.